Where's my spot?
Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome to Edible Education 101. This is our fourth class of the 2020 semester, and I'm really happy to be here. You know, this morning I wandered into the orchard, and I was just astonished to see these blooms. This is from a Santa Rosa plum tree, which was a variety that Luther Burbank actually introduced in 1906 from his house in Santa Rosa. He was known as the Wizard of Plants, and I was just awestruck with the sky and the fragrance coming off these blooms. And then I kind of thought to myself, wait a minute, isn't this kind of early for this? And I have this habit of sharing my morning garden pictures with friends by text. And so I texted this to a couple of people, and one wrote back, Beth wrote back, she said, "Oh, that's gorgeous, but we just hit 415 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere." And then I sent it to another friend. He actually is in Delhi this week. And he said, "Wow, spectacular blue sky. The air quality index just hit 215 plus in Delhi this morning." So I was all of a sudden like sobered by the beautiful blue sky we were experiencing in Sonoma County, and had one of those zoom out moments where I had a little bit bigger picture of what was going on. And then all of a sudden I thought, wait a minute, let me try to embrace this change maker mindset, right? Where change makers are able to hold enormous sort of contradiction, paradox, and complexity all at once. So I started to think, okay, instead of using that word but, it's a beautiful day, but I thought, let's use the word and. It's a beautiful day, and the climate crisis is accelerating and is very real, and that I have friends not too far away who are actually experiencing the dynamics of that, like many of us did last fall with the Sonoma County fires. So tonight we have a very exciting program for you, and it's timed perfectly with the election. A little later in the evening, I'm going to introduce you to Aria, who's here with voter registration forms that you can fill out tonight if you haven't done that yet. So we're going to do that a little bit later. But before that, we've got three very knowledgeable change makers in their own right from the award-winning publication Civil Eats. So we're going to have Naomi, Matt, and Twilight with us in a few minutes. You know, this semester, we've been focusing on core values in action. We've been thinking about how do our core values, those things we care about and hold dearly, how do they manifest in our actions each day? And you'll remember last week, this wonderful panel. Remember Tiffany Patton, she did an awesome job last week, didn't she? Yeah, let's a big hand for Tiffany. I'm sure she's watching tonight. But Tiffany asked this question of the farmer. She said, "What are your core values?" Do you remember what was the universal answer? Anybody remember what they said? Anybody? You don't remember? Relationships. Remember they said, we value relationships. We value relationships with the land. We value relationships with the eaters and the people that are buying our product. We appreciate the relationship we have with the local community and their constituents. I thought that was very powerful because really at the heart of any high-performance organization, or whether it's nonprofit or for-profit, are often a set of defining principles or core values. At the Haas School of Business here, we have 4 key defining values that if I haven't shared them with you yet, I want to tonight. One of them is question the status quo. Another is about confidence without attitude. third is students always. We're always learning. And then the other is beyond yourself. So thinking about our impact we make and the potential to care for the commons and the broader good. So as you think about, I was thinking a lot about values as they pertain to one of the goals for the course of developing food systems intelligence and appreciating relationships like our 3 farmer guests last week do is really core to understanding food systems intelligence. And you know what I thought I would do tonight is go back to last week and share with you a little snippet of Professor Wendy Silver's presentation and give you kind of like a little bit of a play-by-play of a couple of things that I thought were absolutely fascinating and relevant to being a food systems change maker. And I also wanted to go back and reference Donella Meadows' systems dance, and I wanted to particularly identify for tonight, maybe as a sub-theme, this idea of locating responsibility in a system as a means of identifying leverage points in that system. So let me show you this. So this starts with this question, what can I do? What can I do? And that I in that graphic is supposed to be Berkeley blue. Let me show you this little clip, and I'll see.
So great, Dr. Wendy Silver, if you would come up and join me.
So this is Tiffany introducing Professor Wendy Silver from last week.
And you can use this mic. So Dr. Wendy Silver is the Rudy Graw Chair and Professor of Ecosystem Ecology and Biogeochemistry at UC Berkeley. You're also the lead scientist of the Marin Carbon Project, and you were recently named a Climate Action Champion at UC Berkeley. So thank you so much for being with us and sharing some of your knowledge.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
So first, I'd love to know what drove you from being a scientist to being a scientist and a climate action champion?
So that's a great question. I mean, I didn't set out to be a climate action champion. I mean, I run and I like to lift weights, but I didn't think that would qualify me to be a climate action champion.
Okay, so first thing, I didn't set out to be a climate action champion, right? She says, I run, I lift weights. This is sort of in the Roman, Greek, Olympic, category of being a champion. But what she's also telling you about is a little bit of her own core values, right? Her appreciation of exercise and health and well-being, and maybe if she's a runner too, she appreciates the outdoors. So she's revealing a little bit about herself in terms of what she cares about.
But what really got me motivated, and I'll show a couple of slides. Let's see if I can get this to go.
Now, right here, she says, what really got me motivated is, let me show you a few slides, and she's futzing with this thing because it doesn't work.
But for some reason, the slide's not showing.
Yeah, some reason the slides aren't showing. But what she really wants to show you is the data. She's a scientist. She wants to show you what motivated her, okay?
A couple of years ago, a report came out. I mean, we've been working on trying to understand the impacts of climate change and trying to slow climate change for more than a decade. And it all kind of came together for me when this report was released by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And that's a group of scientists from countries all over the world that get together and try to write a consensus report. And if any of you have any friends or colleagues that are scientists, you'll know that getting us to agree on something is really, really, really hard. And so these consensus reports are important. What they're doing is summarizing the state of science on a topic, and in this case, the state of science on climate change. And they're, to be honest, they're conservative, they're kind of watered down. And that's because it's so hard to get people to agree on the wording. And this report that came out recently, and I'll just read this quote from it, said, all pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is too much, right? We already know that 1.5 degrees Celsius is going to result in a lot of changes that are going to be hard for us to take. So all pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with little or no overshoot project the use of carbon dioxide removal on the order of 100 to 1,000 gigatons of CO2 over the 21st century. A gigaton is 10 to the 15th grams of carbon. It's a lot of carbon. What that's saying is emissions reduction is no longer sufficient to solve the climate change problem. We have to remove CO2 out of the atmosphere in addition to reducing emissions. That's what got me motivated, was that need to somehow think about not just lowering emissions, but also removing carbon dioxide, and then saying, well, what could I do as an ecologist and a biogeochemist that might help us move towards those solutions?
That's what motivated me. That's what got me thinking about this. That's what got me to ask, what can I do? Here's one of the actually world's leading scientists in this field, a prestigious member of our faculty here at Berkeley, asking herself, what can I do?
Awesome, thank you. So I don't read all of the IPCC reports because I am not a scientist, but it's pretty dense stuff. But last year I read a briefing on the one on land management and climate, and they were talking about how basically land is such a critical resource and how we manage the land is super vital to that. And so poor land management, which you see a lot with industrial agriculture, fuels a lot of land degradation and deforestation, and that contributes so much to greenhouse gas emissions. But if we manage the land better, we can not only, as you were saying, not only reduce how much we emit, but also take it out. And so can you tell us a little bit about the Marin Carbon Project first, actually?
Sure.
And who's working on that?
Yeah, so
this is the little other snippet I want you to watch, because this is about the dynamic called serendipity or synchronicity. This is when unexpected coincidences come together. A lot of times people think that we're on a very direct and linear path to where we're going, that we have a clear idea of how we want to make our mark in the world or our dent in the universe, and that we've got it all figured out. Even, brilliant scientists with great fame and acclaim. But there's something that happens when a bunch of unexpected coincidences happen. So listen carefully to this section.
So the Marin Carbon Project was and this is a great story because I think it just shows the power of people. It was just a group of us. It was a rancher from Marin and the guy he had hired as his ranch consultant, who happened to have a PhD in range management, but had been working, most of his job was working on an olive farm, and the rest of the time he went and consulted on ranches. And they had seen a news report on the fact that climate change was going to drive a lot of changes in agriculture that were going to be detrimental to the food production system. And they wondered if there was anything that they could do on their lands to help solve this problem, to help slow climate change. And so through a very odd set of coincidences, really, they ended up at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab meeting with a colleague of mine on a completely different question, and had said, hey, do you know any scientists that work on soils and carbon? And my colleague said, well, as a matter of fact, I do. He called me up, and I went up to meet these folks up at the lab, and they said, what about soil? Is there anything we could do with our soil? And I said, well, that's a really good question. We don't really know, right? We hadn't done that research as a scientific community. We hadn't really determined, first, could we detect a change in soil carbon? And secondly, could we change management to really suck carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into soils?
So that's this amazing moment of unexpected coincidence. What can I do? How does one become a climate champion? And serendipity. So values, her expressing her values, where she places herself in the world. Then she has this catalyst, which is the report. I like to call that the call. The call would be in the context of how Joseph Campbell, the great scholar on mythology and the power of myth, would say somebody gets the call. The call often happens when you're in a place that's a little bit outside your normal routine. So she gets the call on this in this meeting that was supposed to be set up for something else. Then a team forms. That's really important. A team forms with complementary expertise, cross-disciplinary expertise, people asking a similar question from different perspectives, and then they all bring this bias for action, right? So this bias for action is what change makers bring to this solution-oriented mindset. So last week you saw Professor Silver. She was thinking about where, with her expertise and her interests, that she could intervene in this biological system by measuring, coming up with methods to measure carbon and to see if there were processes with working with the farmers and the ranchers to sequester carbon. And then tonight, with our guests from Civil Eats, who have a journalistic platform, they're going to be talking about, and I just took this, Naomi, to say, kind of interacting or intervening in that social system of food literacy, really talking to a lot of the people that are involved in the food system, trying to inform them about where is truth, where is their opportunity emergent, and probably most important for this era, how do we develop digital literacy in an era of great organized misinformation and disinformation? And I'm so delighted to introduce to you one of my heroes, a tireless, really, worker on behalf of the food system, the founder and editor of Civil Eats. Please welcome Naomi Starkman.
Thank you, Will, for that lovely introduction. It's really nice to be here. This is, I think, my 4th year being here. And in the 4 years that I've been here talking about media literacy, things have gotten much, much worse, unfortunately. But we're here to talk also about what's working, and that's really what we do at Civil Eats. Civil Eats is a daily news organization. We started in 2009. At the time, there was really no online platform for meaningful conversation around the food system. Really taking a systems approach like this class, and you're all so lucky to be able to take a class like this, because when I started in school, I had to follow a really strange trajectory, which had a lot of serendipity. But I went to school to study international relations, and then I went to law school. I thought I would be a lawyer. I ended up working in the city of San Francisco as the deputy director of the city agency, the Ethics Commission. And then I decided I really wanted to do something entirely different, and I moved to New York City to work in mainstream media. And while I was in New York, I met Alice Waters, the founder of this course, and Alice really changed my life, and I decided to become a farmer. So I went from lawyer to media person to farmer, and in 2009 I started Civil Eats. I'm lucky enough to have a remarkable team. It's all about relationships. And these people sitting next to me are really the best in the business. And I want to let Twilight Greenaway and Matt Whelan introduce themselves and talk a little bit about what brought you to this work and your past and our serendipity.
Sure. Hi. Writing and editing stories about the food system since around 2006.
No, I think it's the sound system.
So I came to this work. I was actually raised on an organic farm. There we go. Now you can hear me. I was raised on an organic farm in Hawaii and went through college with a lot of folks who had idealism around farming, and I was like, no way, that's boring, that's not interesting to me. It really wasn't until I was striking out as a writer in my late 20s, early 30s that I thought, what is it that I'm really excited about and comfortable with and interested in? And it was at a moment when the local food movement was really kind of bubbling up here, and I got a job working at Quesa, which is an organization that runs the farmers market in the city, the big one at the Ferry Building. And I started visiting farms and learning about farmers and writing other stories on the side, and that got me excited and interested. And there were so many huge questions that I knew I couldn't answer, and I wanted to dig in and sometimes provide answers, but often ask more questions.
And so I'm Matt. I've been the managing editor at Civil Eats for a little over 3 years now. And I've been an environmental journalist and working in online news since 2001. So I've seen a lot of different changes in online news. And food and farming has always been an interest to me, but I haven't covered it as long as these two. But I have dabbled in just about everything else that you can in environmental journalism. Whether it's sustainable business, whether it's renewable energy, politics and policy, I've kind of done everything. But coming to Civil Eats has been great because food is a personal passion, but also the way that we approach the news is unlike anywhere else I've ever worked online. That, to Twilight's point about asking the questions, we ask a lot of the questions that most other publications don't ask, and that readers don't even know they should be asking. And I think that's a big part of what we want to talk about tonight is what do you need to think about as you're consuming news online that comes in such a great array of quality and depth. And I think we do a pretty good job on the quality and the depth front.
We do. We've been lucky enough to receive a number of awards. We were the James Beard Foundation's Publication of the Year in 2014. Last year, we were inducted into the Library of Congress. We also were named the inaugural Impact Media. We received the inaugural Impact Media Award from the Food and Farming Communications Fund. And our work is regularly cited by numerous organizations, and we partner with mainstream media. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight is where you guys are getting your information and how you're understanding not just the media ecosystem, but the food media ecosystem, and trying to connect the dots between the two. And ask you guys some questions as well, and hopefully you'll have some questions for us. I just want to start really quickly here. I should say at the outset, we have Twilight for about 20 minutes, and so we're going to kind of race through the front part because she has such a wealth of knowledge, and we want to make sure that we maximize our time with her. But just as a reminder, and this may seem like you all know this, but this is an important fact to restate, can't be restated enough, that the First Amendment of the United States guarantees the freedom of the press. This is a really important point. It's in our Constitution. And journalists, even though we have been often called, the enemy of the people by President Trump, we actually are speaking truth to power. Our job actually is to help you decipher fact from fiction, although that's really become very complicated today. And so part of what we're going to talk about tonight is what's happening in the media ecosphere itself. There's been a tremendous loss of jobs, unfortunately, in journalism. Last year alone, 3,000 journalism jobs were lost. And at the same time, a number of papers in local communities have also shuttered. Right now, we have kind of a dichotomy between the largest publications, like the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, the Washington Post, owned by billionaires, or some of the smaller online publications being funded by hedge funds or venture capitalists. And journalists are just not faring well on either end of the spectrum. And then you have these local small papers that are really sort of losing their writers. And so this stat came in from 2004. The US has lost around 2,000 newspapers, 70 of them dailies, and about 1,000 surviving titles are referred to as ghost papers, because they have such painfully thin staff. And it's resulting in what they're now calling news deserts. I'm sure Will has spoken to you a little bit about food deserts. This is a very common phenomenon that's happening when it comes to media as well. And at the same time, people still trust local news, although only about 14% of the public is currently paying for their local news. Even Warren Buffett, who until very recently, considered himself a news freak, just sold off 30 of his papers for $140 million in cash. So it doesn't really bode very well for the confidence of journalism when one of the world's richest men decides that he's no longer investing in journalism either. At the same time, you're seeing some of the bigger papers like the New York Times sort of counteracting or sort of following up on stories around food and agriculture, but relying on mainstream sources. And so we want to pull together the threads of the media issue with the issue around food and ag. And this is a story that just ran recently. This is a decision by the Trump administration. It's the waters of the United States. It's a rollback. It's actually considered probably one of the most detrimental impacts to our water system in the United States. And the only people that the New York Times cited in terms of farmers were from the Farm Bureau. And that's a problem because there are so many different kinds of farmers in the United States. The Farm Bureau in this piece cites the repeal as a victory for farmers. And the Farm Bureau lobbyists said in this piece, farmers and fossil fuel groups supported the change. So on the other side of that coin is something like the Storm Lake Times. And I know recently Michael Pollan, who's with us tonight, spoke with Art Cullen. The Storm Lake Times is a tiny paper. It's a twice-weekly newspaper in rural Iowa with a circulation of about 3,000. And its editor, Art Cullen, received the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for a series of editorials on dark money and corporate agriculture in Iowa. And I just wanted Twilight to speak a little bit to Art Cullen because she's had the honor of speaking to him, interviewing him, reading his book, and she and Matt were both at Michael's recent talk. Just a little bit more about the uniqueness of what Art Cullen's doing.
Sure. So first I wanted to say a little bit about the story we just touched on, the Waters of the U.S. one, because I feel like it's this interesting phenomenon where the lack of these local papers and the lack of reporters who are trusted in these local areas, not that there aren't any there are, in some cases they're there, but they're not well connected, or they're not getting the call from the New York Times to cover the story. That kind of vacuum that exists, I think, is a big part of why these rural areas are not seen in their full complexity. And so if there was a local reporter there, they might know a farmer who had a differing opinion than the industry-led Farm Bureau. And a lot of the time the Farm Bureau is run by folks who are also farmers, which is very convenient because then the paper can say, I spoke with a farmer about his hogs or about his corn operation. And not to say that those perspectives are not absolutely valid, but they're often the only perspectives we hear in those stories. And so in the case of Art Cullen, he's doing something pretty brave and pretty interesting. There was a lawsuit that took place in Iowa. The way it works is farmers, essentially the nitrogen pollution that's coming into the waterways in these areas where there's a lot of corn and soy grown, mostly corn and soy grown in limited rotations. Often it's corn on corn on corn, meaning there's nothing to soak up the nitrogen, there's no cover crops, there's nothing other than these few crops. So the nitrogen is flowing into the rivers and the waterways, and there's a pretty large water filtration system outside of Des Moines. And the Des Moines Water Works sued several counties in Iowa, and one of the counties happened to be where the Storm Lake Times is located. And so Art Cullen, who's had this tiny independent paper in Storm Lake for years and is kind of keeping it alive on a shoestring, he started asking questions about the pushback to the lawsuit, and noticed that there was all this money being poured in to fight this rather large, rather high-profile lawsuit. And he started asking questions and writing editorials about it, and over time started to uncover the connection to these really large agribusiness interests. And really raised the issue in a way that it hadn't been raised, at least. It was bubbling up in the Des Moines paper, but it was an important moment. And so he, as it says on the top of his paper, he won the Pulitzer, which was really exciting.
And kind of interesting, too, is that he now, even though he still has his paper, he's writing for major U.S. papers now. So he's writing a number of editorials for The Guardian, for The Washington Post. So he's kind of made a name for himself, but he's using and kind of harnessing mainstream media to get his message out. And, you know, this election cycle, we've really seen that actually the candidates have really plugged into concerns around agriculture on a level that I don't think any of us have ever seen, and it's quite astounding. So, and then the mainstream media has really been picking up on those stories. There's a farmer, Matt Russell, who I think has been on every single TV show, you know, from the Today Show and CNN, and he's written for us, and he's a really good example of a farmer, a kind of farmer that maybe is different than the farmer that you would just refer to, that might be kind of hand-selected from the Farm Bureau to message on stories around farming. You know, part of what's happening is in this kind of lack of journalists, we're having a growth in communications. And so today we have about 6 PR professionals for every journalist. And we can really attest to this because we are bombarded every day with about 100, if not more, of press releases about any number of subjects. And we are a very unique newsroom in that we really only have the means to do one very thoughtful piece a day. And we really try to be additive. We really try to think it's a puzzle for us every day. How are we going to make a difference? We don't need to chase or kind of follow the 24/7 news cycle. How can what we do really make a difference? So that kind of gets us to the question of media literacy. What does it mean? Where do people get their news? And I'd love for you guys just to tell us a little bit. You can just shout out where you guys get your news. Where are you following news?
New York Times, Twitter.
Okay, NPR, Twitter, New York Times. Grist, great. Bloomberg. BBC. CNN. Anybody on Facebook, or is that just like for old people? Instagram, okay.
TikTok.
What about TikTok? Anything else?
Snapchat highlights.
Okay, Snapchat highlights, okay. And where are you guys getting your food news? Like for this, I know I looked at your syllabus, I looked at your reading selections, but where are you guys reading about food? Fern? Say it again? Vegnews.com. Bon Appetit YouTube. I hear you. Anything else? Okay. So this is really helpful actually for us because we're trying to understand what media literacy is. So it's actually defined as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate messages in a variety of forms. But I think, and I think probably my colleagues would agree, that media literacy has really radically evolved into understanding Snapchat and watching YouTube videos from Bon Appetit and creating hashtags and making a TikTok video. And so your media literacy has completely changed in this, I would say in the last 5 years in particular. And so, you know, the question also then becomes, who is a journalist? And what does it mean to be a reporter? And what is journalism? And what has sprung up in between? So are there influencers? Is this lifestyle? What does wellness mean? These are all gray areas. This is an example we thought would be really helpful. So this was a story that appeared on Teen Vogue. Now, Teen Vogue has done some incredible reporting in the last several years. I mean, I really have to give them a lot of accolades for their reporting, particularly on informing young people around the political agenda, elections. It's just very empowering reporting. But this was a kind of a problematic piece because it was really about Facebook's efforts to safeguard political speech, but it didn't have a byline, meaning it didn't have an author, and it was very glowing. And the problem with this was that after it was posted, an editor's note appeared on top of it, and it said, "This is sponsored editorial content." Now, sponsored content is very complicated. If you haven't watched the John Oliver video describing what sponsored content is, I highly recommend it. It's problematic in our industry because it looks like it's editorial content, but it's actually an ad.
And in this case, this was an ad. And this was an ad from Facebook, which Sheryl Sandberg actually shared and said, great piece from Teen Vogue. Well, Teen Vogue actually took the piece down because it was too confusing, and they apologized. So this question of the difference between what's fact and what's fake is really, really challenging. And Will spoke a little bit about disinformation. And we are truly in the era of disinformation. This was a BuzzFeed article that Twilight had raised when we were talking about what we were going to talk about. This story was an investigation in which BuzzFeed identified 100 sites dating back to at least 2015 that had been plagiarizing stories from major news organizations, masquerading as local news and financial outlets. And that's a problem. So this isn't even news. And I read, the headlines. I read the New York Times. I read the Washington Post. I read all the headlines every day. And I use Google News. Well, this investigation actually found out that Google News was quite problematic in creating and sharing these fake stories. So you guys probably didn't watch the State of the Union because you're busy students. If you did, I commend you. But what you probably did see was the image of Nancy Pelosi tearing up the speech, right? So I'm sure you all saw this. What you might not have known was that there was actually a whole other video in which President Trump used that moment in which Nancy Pelosi, which at the end of the State of the Union, she had torn up the speech, actually edited it to make it seem like she did it at a very critical time in his speech when he was giving honors to some folks. And Twitter and Facebook refused to take it down. So here's something that happened in a timeline chronologically, been edited to seem like it's something else. It's been shared 11 million times. So what is fact? What is fake? This is I highly recommend this article from The Atlantic. If you can see what the little headline there says, it says the Trump campaign is planning to spend more than $1 billion and will be aided by a vast coalition of partisan media outside political groups and enterprising freelance operatives. These pro-Trump forces are poised to wage what could be the most extensive disinformation campaign in U.S. history. Whether or not it succeeds in re-electing the president, the wreckage it leaves behind could be irreparable. So, how do you recognize a fake news story? Here are some really good tips here. And we don't have a lot of time to go through here, but I will give this slide to Will and he can share it with you. But you want to find out what the source is. You want to find out if, in fact, it's a real source and whether the story is real. If you find yourself having a very extreme reaction, check the story quickly. Always check the date on the story. Make sure that the story is actually up to date and that you're sharing the most relevant story in the storyline. But this sort of way to recognize fake news will help you. And it will help you also recognize sort of what's real, what's not. And I just want to read this from Vox. This is a story in the beginning of the month by Sean Illing and Vox. And he wrote, the title of the article is Flood the Zone with Shit. Sorry, that's the title of the story. How misinformation overwhelmed our democracy. We live in a media ecosystem that overwhelms people with information. Some of the information is accurate, some of it is bogus, and much of it intentionally misleading. The result is a policy that has increasingly given up on finding out the truth. People are numb and disoriented, struggling to discern what is real in the sea of slant, fake, and fact. So, where does that all connect to food and agriculture? This slide here is from a kind of a big PR effort called the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance, which started in 2011 as a reaction to the documentary film Food Inc. And when we first started covering the U.S. Farmer and Ranchers Alliance, we had a lot of questions about who was behind them. They receive a lot of their funding from Monsanto, DuPont, some of the big ag groups, and yet they were promoting themselves and holding these quote-unquote food dialogues all around the country to make it seem like they were talking about food systems. But we had a lot of questions about what the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance was doing. They now have a campaign called 30 Harvests, and we wrote recently about them, and we wrote a little bit about their efforts to talk about climate change, and I don't know if either of you want to weigh in a little bit about that new campaign.
Go for it.
I was struck by this because it did mark a really big shift for this group that has basically been represented by big ag interests. And here they are talking about the interests that Civil Eats is interested in, that we don't overlap with big ag as much as U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance would. So we had a reporter dig into that story. What is behind this 30 Harvest campaign? What does it mean? Who are they including? And is it real? Like, are they serious about their commitment? And or is it really just part of that PR campaign to start getting people thinking about sustainability without necessarily doing anything about it, if that's not too harsh?
Yeah, it was interesting how none of their literature had addressed climate change at all. I don't even think they'd used the language of climate change. And then suddenly they were talking about how farmers can be the solution to climate change, which is an important point and very interesting, but they went very quickly to, we are the answer. We are not the problem. And that was, kind of a fascinating
And we're seeing that
switch.
a lot now. I think,
Yes.
with last week's class, if you all saw last week's class, regenerative agriculture is everywhere. And even when we saw Art Cullen talk, he's talking about regenerative all the time. But what's missing is this question of like, will it work? What does it look like? How do we sustain it over the long term? It's really this search for, this is the thing that's going to solve all our problems. Let's chase after it.
Right, and as we know, regenerative agriculture is kind of the Wild West. I mean, I know you talked about it last week, but all different kinds of farmers are defining it all different kinds of ways. There was a story, or a farmer quoted in this story who farms thousands of acres, and when we actually tried to ask him, okay, so what is it? What exactly are you doing to solve this problem or to regenerate your soil? Mostly he talked about his irrigation, so it's tricky.
And it's really important to note that oftentimes companies, especially companies we interview, only want to talk about what they want to talk about. And we have a hard time getting them to kind of talk off message, and that's okay. I mean, that's what corporate communications departments do. But they only want to talk, and they only want to share how they want to be covered. In particular, this last week, the Plant-Based Products Council, we had a really stellar piece talking about the complexities, and this is really what I think we do best, which is looking at an issue and really giving it some deep treatment about compostable plasticware and whether it's actually any better than plastic. And our reporter, who's a former reporter from the Associated Press, did a very lengthy review.
And the Cal alum.
Yes, and she's a Cal alum. Gosha Wozniacka. She did this great piece, really in depth, but then we started seeing like this kind of almost trolling on social media about our story, calling our story misleading. But when you look at their actual blog about our story, every point that they made was not that we were misleading, but they wished that it was different. And that's fine, but that's not misleading. So calling news you don't like fake, which we're seeing a plethora of, or seeing a story you don't like that doesn't come to the conclusion that you want as misleading, it's really damaging, at least in our opinion. This is a great example, and I'll let Twilight weigh on this, because oftentimes we get kind of attacked, it's a strong word, but from either side of, industry versus folks who really want us to report in a certain way. And this particular week, we had two stories that were kind of diametrically opposed.
Yeah, we're in an interesting position where there isn't much of a sense that we might question two sides of one issue, that we might write about what ranchers are doing well, what ranchers may not be doing well, what a meat alternative company is doing that could help the environment, and what a meat alternative company is doing that could be potentially unhealthy for people. So we ran two stories in 1 week, and it was fascinating because we got attacked by the opposite people. We ran this story which was about two different, similar but different efforts to provide resources for farmers in animal agriculture who want to transition to growing more plants. And one of them is Miyoko Schinner.
Mm-hmm.
She has an alternative dairy company, and she is working with one dairy farmer who wants to get out of dairy. And there's another similar project. So we covered them, and in the same week I wrote this editorial. There was an editorial on The Guardian by a man who argued that we should just produce most of our food in laboratories, and I pushed back a little by saying I think that there are benefits to lab-produced food, but farming, let's not forget farming, essentially. And so I got quite a bit of trolling and attacks from folks who were saying, oh, you're invalidating the role of these plant-based alternatives. So I think it goes back to the idea that folks don't always know what journalism is, and granted, sometimes we write op-eds, and this isn't sort of an unusual case, but we do try to look critically at both sides of this conversation. We're not an advocacy group that's pushing for plant-based alternatives. We're not an advocacy group that's pushing, for ranching and animal product production. And yet, the internet seems to believe that everyone is on one side or the other.
I think it's a really important point because actually the Plant-Based Council that I mentioned earlier called us a group. And that's often what happens. If they don't like what you're reporting on, then you're somehow an advocacy organization. And that's problematic because we're actual journalists, and our job is really to vet out what the truth is and to report it in a way that we feel is timely and informational and factful. So in your process, while you guys are reading about food systems and you're reading about news, always consider the source. 7 o'clock. Can you stay a little bit? Okay, great. Okay, great. So one of our heroes, and she comes and speaks at Will's class, is Marion Nessel. She's on our advisory board. Marion's amazing at identifying the industry study of the week. Oftentimes, you'll see nutrition studies that say, coffee's really bad for you. No, coffee's really good for you. Although Michael Pollan now has the latest on coffee. You've got to hear his new Audible book on caffeine. Or dairy is bad for you. No, dairy is good for you. Eggs in particular, this week they're really bad for you. Next week they're good for you. So we actually, as an organization, try to avoid nutrition reporting for this reason. And in particular, we have reported on the connection between how many studies are funded, either by large groups that are backed by industry. In particular, as Coke has funded many, many studies and kind of has had its own disinformation campaign. But in particular, this was a recent study that kind of upended sort of years of research around reducing your meat consumption. Problem was that the lead researcher who was associated with the study did not disclose that he actually receives money from the industry. Came out later, so there's all this fanfare. And so understanding when you see a nutrition study, asking yourself, who funded this study? If you're reading something that says chocolate is the best thing, you've got to eat it all the time, and it says funded by Hershey's, ask yourself the question, like, who is funding this study? Is this actual journalism?
Well, and the tricky thing is it's not going to say funded by Hershey's, right? It's going to say funded by this trade group that has a perfectly neutral sounding name that you've never heard of.
Right, and actually, just to cite one of those groups is the International Life Science Institute. It's an industry trade group, and they receive a lot of money from McDonald's and Coke and Pepsi and Cargill. So just asking and looking in a little bit when you see nutrition studies, I think, is really important. We want to turn a little bit back to some of the earlier points we made around the importance of local news coverage and connect it a little bit better and more succinctly to food coverage. So Kim Severson and her team at the New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize for reporting on this restaurant in New York City called the Spotted Pig that had a really terrible history of harassment. And it was sort of at the kind of crux of the Me Too moment. And Kim's reporting, she's a food reporter, but she reports on a lot of things, but her reporting was really important because it kind of showed and held a light to this terrible action, and actually the restaurant has since closed, and the Times has also continued to report on that. Matt, maybe you want to talk us through this whole story that the San Francisco Chronicle has been uncovering.
Yeah, this was a really interesting story that came out just earlier this month, I believe. That really has its roots in local reporting, that this was Well, the backstory is the owner of this restaurant, or maybe it was the manager, was working on a Saturday night and started getting Grubhub deliverers coming in to pick up orders, and they're not on Grubhub. So she, found the time to do a little digging and see what happened, and she posted on Twitter what was going on. That Grubhub was using her restaurant's name to sell comparable, similar food to unsuspecting people who thought they were getting food from restaurant A and were getting it from a ghost kitchen, basically a storefront where people are cooking. And the Chronicle reporter saw the tweet, got in touch with the manager, and basically did the reporting and aired this issue that seems to be endemic across these platforms, that as demand rises, they are looking for ways to continue their business growth, cash in on some of those hot restaurants, and the diners have no idea, and it's hurting the restaurant owners, it's hurting the diners because they're not getting what they think they're paying for, and these companies in the middle are benefiting from it. And I think it's an example of really what's possible with a local reporter who knew the restaurant, who knew the story behind it, and was able to run with it and turn it into a really interesting story that I think resonates around the country.
So last year, I was lucky enough to have Soleil Ho here on a panel on media and representation, and Soleil is the new food critic for the San Francisco Chronicle. She replaced Michael Bauer after 30 years of his service as the main food critic at the San Francisco Chronicle, and she has completely upended food criticism, not only in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, but in the nation, frankly. This is a piece she wrote writing about kind of one of the oldest restaurants in San Francisco, Le Colonial, and it's really worth reading. She really is taking on food criticism in a whole new way, and much to the kind of chagrin of some old school reporters, and there was this Marina Times editor who completely freaked out about Soleil's reporting, and I just have to read this because I just think it's so great. Marina Times editor Susan Dyer Reynolds' article, it was called Cirque du Soleil, is a cri de coeur against political correctness, and a very tired one. A colander leaking steams of anger over the direction of the wider culture. It's the pernicious kind, the kind that delegitimizes someone who substantively critiques their words. It contains lots of adjectives like rambling and tortured, all without marshaling any evidence that Ho rambles or tortures. Because Reynolds' real point is that to have read about cultural appropriation when you prefer to read about moule frite is torture. So we think, these new writers, people like Soleil and others, Frank Chagan at the LA Times, who's an incredible reporter. He doesn't write just about food, but he's really connecting the dots. Maybe Twilight, you want to talk about this story a little bit?
Oh, this story was just moving for me. There was this sandwich, I believe, chicken sandwich, or maybe it was just fried chicken, but it was, the latest hot thing in LA's Chinatown, and people were waiting for hours to try this chicken, and he decided he would wait in line and buy chicken and bring it to some of the lower wage workers in Chinatown to try it, to see what they thought, since there was no way they were going to stand in line or want to spend the money on it. And it's a beautiful piece that acknowledges the complexities of modern life and modern Chinatown in particular.
And I think Frank and Soleil and others are really trying to connect the dots between the wider culture. Last year we also had Stephen Satterfield, who is the editor-in-chief of Whetstone, which is a really great publication. It has a lot of features from all over the world, specifically around women. And then Clancy Miller just finished her Indiegogo to raise money for an all-black female print magazine called For the Culture. And so there are new voices who are out there, and I really recommend, we all recommend following them and understanding their vantage point and where they come from. Matt, you take away this one.
Oh, this is, we're doing a bit of a 90-degree turn here. Just that headline, it gets at kind of everything that we have talked about in terms of media and the lack of questioning about what's underneath a story. But just that headline, like it is meant to catch your attention. You're gonna read it, you're gonna agree, you're gonna wanna go try this Beyond Meat chicken. And I think that in the food world, similar to regenerative agriculture, these alternative proteins are huge. Like we are really high on the hype cycle for Impossible Burgers and Beyond Meat everything. And there just aren't a lot of questions being asked about what does it mean to make these really processed foods and offer them as a plant-based alternative, because nobody calls it vegetarian, it's rarely called vegan, it's a plant-based protein. And what happens both if you scale them up, what are the impacts on the planet, what are the environmental impacts, where are they going to be produced, and then what are the impacts for people who are going to eat them? And I think this story in particular just jumped out at me because it was so attention-grabbing and so lacking in depth and questioning, and it's sort of the opposite of what we try to do. And we've done a few pieces on these alternative proteins and digging into what the questions are, and there aren't answers yet, and I think that's hard in the media world now, is if you don't have an answer, then you don't really want to ask the question because it's going to leave people unsatisfied.
Let's take a look at a few of our stories. Before we do that, I want to just give a shout out to the UC Berkeley journalism program with the 11th Hour, which Michael and Malia Wolin and a few others run. That's right here in Berkeley, and they select incredible fellows every year who all produce really remarkable work. So there are people who are working hard to not craft a headline like it's a damn miracle.
It worked. It was a great headline.
It's very clicky. It's clickbait.
Very clicky.
Here's some of the stories that I think we all selected as an edit team that we thought would be great to just share with you guys about some of the really tough questions. And these stories get a lot of attention in the media. So vertical farming, it's going to save the world. It's going to feed the masses. Is it? We don't actually know. So maybe, Twilight, you want to take a crack at this story or share your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think vertical farming is held up as a successful solution before there's a lot of really strong evidence, and it's in a lot of ways it's taken over kind of the local food space, or it's moving into the local food space. Such this idea that that if it's grown in a warehouse with artificial lighting, as long as that warehouse with artificial lighting is in your city, that's somehow better. And it may be, if we're talking purely food miles, it may be better. But it's been full of really beautiful images. I think that's a big part of the appeal of vertical farming. We see these like gorgeous diagrams of skyscrapers with these beautiful sort of cascades of food growing out of them, and there's this kind of utopian, visionary quality to the images that I think really has been selling it for people. And who knows? There may be some positives. It seems like there are some positives, but there's also a ton of energy being used. There's the potential for really large companies to own a lot of the production, much in the way that is already happening. So it doesn't seem to be really breaking the mold in terms of ownership models or approaches to paying workers better, or a lot of the issues we see with agriculture that's happening on land. It's replicating quite a bit of that. So yeah.
Like it's not a
the jury
revolution.
is still out.
Exactly. It's not a revolution, it's an evolution. And what does it look like?
And actually a lot of them, the new ones are moving towards, from what I can tell, not actually having very many people involved at all. Right. There's a big one in Kentucky that I spoke to the owner, and he's hiring some people, selling it as like local workers in Appalachia, in an area where the coal industry is dying, and so he's going to replace it with this factory. But he's also moving towards AI, and his goal ultimately is to have a factory run by 5 or 10 people.
Yeah. Here's another story we wrote about synthetic biology. So all those things that make your meat bleed, your veggie burgers bleed, and all the things that are kind of making our food, as Michael would call probably food stuff, food-like food, those things are made from synthetic biology. Okay, Twilight is going to leave us.
Sorry.
Thank you, Twilight.
Thank you, Twilight. We wrote this article kind of asking the same questions, right? So like, what's behind it? Who's Twilight is making...
Trying to turn my microphone off here.
Anyhow, this piece we wrote was really asking those same questions and asking who's behind the funding of that. And then this is a piece that Stephen Satterfield wrote for us. So there's been a lot of press and attention, public attention. It's really ignited the public's imagination around food waste. And Imperfect Food came on the scene, and it seemed like a great solution. And then there was a real dust-up with the local organization actually here, because a lot of the local organizations feel like Imperfect is not really as perfect as it should be, and they're taking the marketplace. And so, again, you know, taking a story that seemed like it was just a slam dunk and that they're just doing great work, we tried to unpack that a little bit and to try to dig in a little bit more to ask harder questions about what Imperfect is really up to.
Mm-hmm. And that was a really interesting one because it is such a complicated story that it's a need, it is meeting a need, but the way in which it was meeting that need, especially as it started to scale up, it was kind of being overlooked in the coverage. And it took this local group saying that Imperfect is stealing our model, and we are a community-based nonprofit aimed at feeding hungry people in our neighborhood, and we can't anymore because Imperfect has bought all of our produce that we used to buy. It was a really, that one made a splash. That was a really good one to put out there. It was fun to see the reaction to that.
So I've been given the time indicator. Will, would you like to join us?
Sure. As long as I don't feed back. Might be okay. I'm kind of on a media fast right now. I do subscribe to Civil Eats. I'm a loyal Civil Eats and Washington Post and New York Times and a couple other places. But after the impeachment and the State of the Union, I literally said, I can't look at this anymore. And I started to think about media consumption like food, you know, that it can make you sick if you're not moderating or you're not being selective or careful about what surrounds you. And one of the things I really appreciate about this class is like it's an aura of positive energy each week. But what's your recommendation in that? You know, I mean, you obviously want people to read, and you guys put out good stuff every day, but how do you navigate? What's your thoughts?
Oh, that's a tough question. I mean, someone here is on the news all the time. She has the opposite approach to you. I think, I mean, to your point, I mean, I think there's something to be said for following Michael's guidelines is, you know, if you're gonna read news, read not too much and read the good stuff. Like, don't spend all your time on Twitter. I'm sorry, like I spent some time on Twitter too, but you're gonna get blasted with way too much information and most of it won't be good. So I think it really is about being selective in both what do you read, where do you get it from, and who do you listen to when other people are telling you these stories? Like how can you kind of interrogate the stories that you're hearing from your friends in your community as well?
And I'll just add that it's kind of like intermittent fasting is all the rage right now. So I actually take a social media Sabbath, believe it or not, starting...
How long is it?
It's over the weekend. So from Friday night until Sunday. I do still read the news, but I get off social media, and it's made a giant difference for me. I do still read the headlines. Being a news person, that's what I do morning and evening, and I do listen to the radio. A lot of people, when I ask the question about where they get their news, a lot of people tell me from the late night comics. And that I saw John Oliver actually on New Year's Eve, and he said that most people who approached him on the street said, thank you for keeping me informed. So pick a source. Pick a source you like, if it's John Oliver, or if it's one of the late night hosts, or you like listening to the radio, or whatever it is, YouTube videos from Bon Appetit, pick it, and just inform yourself that way, and then turn it off.
I think this comment that you made about being labeled or categorized as a group is just so interesting, because we're in this era of the mastery of the control of the narrative, and you talk about the startup companies that really attracted disproportionate amounts of capital. I mean, the companies that you've mentioned here that are making plant-based alternatives, they also had the sort of unusual experience of receiving unprecedented amounts of financing that, you know, from my era, we never were able to access. And with that money, they've really focused on controlling the narrative. And I actually was contacted by a CNN reporter not long ago that was trying to verify, they were writing a story about one of these companies that they were out of stock on their product, and they were writing it as if they were out of stock because it was so popular. That's the way it had been spun. But the reality was they were actually out of stock because they had not built enough manufacturing capability to fill the pipeline of one of the fast food chains that had taken it into their menu. So there was a shortage, and they turned the shortage from really their faux pas. They got a big order. They weren't really ready to fulfill it, but they spun it with the media that it was because it was consumer demand driving, you know, this runaway new product. So I thought, you know, the mastery of the way they're telling the story is just really powerful. And then not only the companies themselves, but then the creation of effectively industry groups posing as institutes doing impartial research, actually doing promotional work on behalf of an emergent industry. So this is just, you know, one thing I just wanted to point out is like you've worked so hard to be rigorously independent in this era, and it's hard to, you know, like if I go to the site, it's even hard for me, like, where's the stamp that says, you know, we are independent, we don't take money. I mean, if you're not reading Marion Nestle's blog, how do people know who's funding and?
Right. I mean, one thing is we don't take advertising, so we have never taken advertising. We are an independent news organization. We are nonprofit. We're entirely reliant on foundations and individuals, and we have a subscription service. We do have a section, a very small section, small fine print on the site that explains, you know, also our transparency guidelines and our ethical guidelines. But I think your point is a really important one, and that is, you know, just like the food system in which young people, you people in particular, are asking food manufacturers for more truth, trust, and transparency, you have to ask the same of your media producers. So when you're going to a site, you know, and you're seeing who is funding that site, where the advertisers are coming from, when you see a story like Teen Vogue and you see that it's actually promoted content or it's sponsored content, asking yourself, stopping to ask yourself, for example, there's a lot of food companies that promote content on Bon Appetit, for example. Like I've seen a whole series of articles that look like it was about baking, but it was really sponsored by Dairy Gold. And, you know, it's like a whole, it looks like a recipe kind of, you know, editorial, but it's actually advertorial. So it requires us all to slow down a little bit and to ask hard questions and to ask the question about who's behind these stories.
Who's got questions for Matt and Naomi? Please come. There's a microphone up here. There's a microphone down here. This is your chance. And if you're at home watching on YouTube, you can also send in a message and we will relay it on your behalf. Here is our, come introduce yourself. Tell us what you're studying, what your name is. Get close to the microphone if you can.
This
Hi.
is a little bit too high.
Yeah, that's okay.
Hello. Okay. I'm Joy Lim, and I'm actually a freshman studying nutritional science here. So that's why I love this class so much. And recently, there has been an epidemic, I don't know if you have heard about it, going on in Asia. It's like going crazy. It's just like what you see from a zombie movie, and no one is in the street. The masks is like out, even here. I cannot find any mask from any of the convenience stores in American California. And turns out the new virus of the lung disease was to be said on social media. It's from eating, because some restaurants were serving bats, like wild animals, to customers, and the customers see that as a kind of maybe social class symbol or cultural thing. So they eat it and got the virus from the bat, which we humans already evolved to be not able to digest. And so my question is, if that is true, this theory is true, do you think the restaurants should, or the food service should take responsible for this? And is it going to be an ethical issue or something to do with law? And also, if this theory is not true, like the disease was coming from something else, should the social media take responsible for this chaos?
So I've been actually following this pretty closely, and there's been some great articles dispelling this, actually. So Foreign Policy of all publications did a really good piece talking about the xenophobia and racism that's surrounding some of the cultural aspects of eating animals out of that market. And so the last reporting I saw, and if anybody else has other information, please share it, was that it actually was a bat that probably infected something else. So it wasn't that actually that they were eating a bat, but the bat, there may have been bats in this live fresh market. They were calling it a wet market, but it might have infected, that the virus was transmitted to this other animal that might have been then further infected people in their consumption. To answer your first question, whether restaurants have an ethical duty not to serve that food, I can't answer that question. That's really a question about culture and food. We need better food safety, and China needs better crisis emergency response when they have a situation like this. One thing I want to just say specifically is that you should all go and eat in Chinatown. Chinatown in the United States in particular, they have suffered a major kind of shutdown right now because people are afraid of getting coronavirus. There's no reason to not eat Chinese food in Chinese restaurants in Chinatown in the United States. And your second question was, how that information gets sort of inferred in social media. And unfortunately, I think the way that social media is working, there's so much fear and panic around coronavirus that, of course, there's a duty to report that. I would probably trust a news source, and if it's a news source that's being shared on social media and it's coming from the WHO or from another reputable source, that's the information I would trust. Always check what you're reading on social media.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. We really appreciate you two coming up and standing up and introducing yourself and presenting your question. One of our members of our teaching team has been fielding questions, online from this class. And she told me this evening, she said it was interesting because the tone of the questions and the tone of the interchange is much harsher and kind of abrupt and aggressive, and sometimes even just out of context.
And that's what we're seeing.
Right, and
It's the
so
polarity.
this insulation or this veil in this media sphere is producing this really kind of rampant incivility. That's why I really appreciate the name of your publication, because to, I think, heal any kind of, to heal this massive polarization that we have in our country and around the world, it really begins with civility, and civility can lead to mutual respect. Mutual respect can lead to trust. But, it's so interesting for you to be existing solely online in that environment where just everybody has a voice, whether they have, sort of an informed perspective or not.
I'll just make the point, we are often called uncivil eats whenever we publish an article that a reader disagrees with. Twice a week, probably, we get
Twice
that.
a week.
And,
So name calling is also
name
big.
calling is,
yeah.
is a thing.
It's up.
So,
Name calling is up.
yeah.
Yeah. Who else is, you got a question right here? And then you're next. Yeah.
My name is Harlow. Thank you for both of your time tonight. So you talked a lot about the power of narrative, and on that topic too of like the bigger like buzzwords, let's say, is probably regenerative agriculture and organic. From like a media literacy perspective, how can we hold bigger ag companies accountable without letting them kind of appropriate science for profit?
Maybe repeat the question. if you
That's
could.
the question of the hour. How do we hold big ag accountable, without shifting the narrative, without letting them kind of,
Without allowing them to claim the narrative.
Yeah, claim the
and
narrative.
Those terms.
I mean,
Do you have an answer for that? 'Cause
I
think
mean,
we
that's
all
the
think
question
that.
we ask every day. It's the best question, really, which is, I think you're having Carla Vernon come.
Next week.
Next week. So ask Carla Vernon that question when she's here. We did a really good piece in conjunction with NBC News about General Mills and what they're trying to do with their work, and they're doing some really important work. But that piece also asks some really hard questions about whether regenerative agriculture is actually succeeding. Like if the goal of regenerative agriculture is actually succeeding. We interviewed a number of soil scientists who say, look, it's great to say that regenerative agriculture could make a difference, and we're all about solutions. So don't get us wrong, but it's really important to see it in a larger context. There's only so much we can do. We want to, put carbon back in the soil, but we have to stop from emitting it. And there's a million ways that we're still continuing to emit it that have nothing to do with agriculture. And so a lot of the people that we interviewed for that piece talk about that. I think just continuing to speak truth to power and asking really hard questions, that's really our job. If you can help us, if you see things that you think need to be called to task, you can let us know too.
Yeah. And if you come across those questions that are those articles or conversations that are raising those questions, spread them, like share that narrative, because that's how all these ideas pass around. And I think that the narrow focus from the companies and the industry groups that are trying to kind of take the reins of these topics, that can be counteracted if enough people are talking about these questions that underlie them.
Thank you.
Hi. Oh. I'm going to stand a little back. Hi, my name's John. I'm a student in geography here. I kind of have a twofold question for you, and it's both about consumption, not so much about food. First, how do media consumers selectively pare down their media consumption, knowing that when we do so, we tend to trend towards any information that would reinforce a preconceived belief we have, thereby giving into a selection bias? Secondarily, how do media producers navigate this bright line of like producing truthful content, right, when talking about kind of odious things or using language that is suffused with a tonal baggage? Like, for example, the term big ag, which kind of carries with it this sort of oppositionalism that instantly disqualifies them as a subject from producing truth. So I'm wondering, like, how do you as producers navigate that bind while engaging with this language? How do us media consumers then avoid selection bias while paring down and selecting sources?
Great questions.
Yeah.
I think paring down your media consumption, and we've spoken about that tonight, is so critical without then being in confirmation bias, right? And so getting off social media is the best way to do that. I mean, Facebook, that's what they traffic in. They're trafficking in tribalism. So you're going to start seeing all your friends and all your colleagues checking the same boxes on social media. I do go on to sort of news searches, and even though Google News is problematic for the reasons I spoke of earlier, I read Fox News. I read all sorts of sources all the time, and I actually will look at a story and then it will say for more coverage underneath that story, and then I'll look at all the ways the story is being covered by 4 or 5 different outlets, what the headlines are, who the bylines are, what they're writing about. It's really challenging. I mean, you're asking the seminal question of our time, and how do we stay outside of our echo chamber? I mean, to your second question, we've used all sorts of terminology around industrial agriculture. You're right, big ag does have its connotations. It is problematic. It's interesting because I sometimes see headlines where I thought, gosh, if we had that headline, we would be so taken to task. Like there's a headline in Newsweek, which is my former publication I used to work at, that was all about how Trump's EPA is wrecking the future of the environment. And I thought, my goodness, if we ever had a headline like that, we would be completely taken to task. So there's kind of a rush or a rise, I guess I would say, in responding to our times. Like we have there's so much at stake. And never before have so many issues really felt so urgent. So it's a very fine line that I think we walk as editors. I'd be curious what your response is.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a very different approach to news consumption. So to your question about paring down, like I truly do pare down. I limit my time on Twitter. I don't check Facebook because I don't find it useful, except for in very limited circumstances. What I have found is a newspaper is a really great resource, and I feel like we're missing that with this news desert and this closing of the industry, that a newspaper presents a bunch of topics that you don't mostly care about, but that are important because they're about your region, about your country, about your town, about your neighborhood, and getting that access to that, just that spread of coverage, I think is really important because it helps you make those connections that you might not otherwise make. So for me, I have a bunch of industry sources that I look at, and then I have a couple of newspapers I read every day. And that's kind of it. And then I'll see other things that pop up on Twitter or wherever else. And I think it comes to your other point about terminology, which is if you pare down, then you can get a sense of the biases that these publications have. Like, where are they coming from? What topics do they cover and in what way? What do they like? What don't they like? And I think for Civilites, I mean, we can say big ag in a headline because that's kind of what we're known for. Like, nobody's coming to us to expect, like, this is the Farm Bureau party line. And I think we're still very selective in what terminology we use for some of these farming operations. But if you know your source and you have this history with interacting with it and reading the publication, then you'll kind of understand where they're coming from. And I think it helps to put that into context.
I found this media bias chart. I think that's really interesting. For the first time this semester, we got a graduate seminar approved for Edible Ed. So we have about 15 graduate students from all across the university coming together Thursday morning to talk about what we do here. And tomorrow's assignment was to take a food issue, whatever they like, GMO, lab-grown meat, whatever it is, and find it on this spectrum of the media bias chart and see how it's reported, across that way. So just, again, as an exercise to try to broaden the perspective and identify where those, views are coming from.
And if I may, I just want to add to that. It's very important to identify that outlets have a point of view. We have a point of view. Our entire existence is because there were really no mainstream media publications when we started focusing on sustainable agriculture, period. They just didn't exist. And I'd like to think that we've led the charge in really changing that. And now our content is shared with mainstream publications. And so this idea of a point of view or bias, there's a big gray area in there. And it's like what Will said at the start of this lecture about being comfortable with complexity and without having the response and understanding that there's a lot to discuss in there. And it's not always linear. It's not always crystal clear.
You have a question here? Where's Allison, too? I'm looking for, you're here. Do you have any questions, too, online yet? Or? Well, you can come up and ask your question. And then...
Hi, thank you so much for informing us on what journalism is and it's meant to be and how we can consume journalism in a more healthy way. My name is Helen, and I came to this stage really from a person who thought about food all the time. So now I'm primarily interested in the food and storytelling or narratives, like how narratives can play a role in shaping the food systems and maybe in improving food systems for the better. And my understanding is journalism is one form of storytelling and can be extended to food, but there are also other forms such as folklores that are food related, or food critiques, or food ads and food literature, and all sorts of things. And I definitely think all of them have an impact. But I was so my question is, so what do you think, like what role do you think journalism in particular can play a role? Yeah.
Well, I kind of want to connect it to what you said about storytelling, and maybe Matt can talk a little bit about the story we did about Jollof and jambalaya. Maybe you can share that.
Yeah, late last year, we spent a lot of time working on a story. This was a woman who was tracing her roots back to West Africa, that Ghana in 2019 was having what they called the Year of Return to mark the 400th anniversary of the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade. And she got a grant to go there and was traveling and came across a really common African dish called jollof rice. And having grown up in the South, she drew the connection between jambalaya, which is a Creole dish. And so we spent a lot of time with her working on, is there a way to connect these two stories and to connect the slave trade and the African diaspora through food? And it was really complicated. I think, the answer is kind of no, but we got a lot of really good questions and did some deep digging on where the slave trade came from, where they ended up, what access would these enslaved people have to ingredients, and would it be possible to recreate these dishes from your culture in a new land? And it was a really unexpected story for us, I think, in that it was just narrative. It was just this woman's story and who she talked to in Ghana and who she talked to here. And she cooked jambalaya with her mother. And it was really great. And it got a lot of readership and a lot of pass along. I think there is a real hunger for those kinds of storytelling, for that narrative. That was a lot of fun to put that together.
And I'll just mention that we did that with America's Test Kitchen, which is a new partnership for us. So that's a traditional outlet that doesn't think about maybe journalism or like reporting as such. And so we were able to kind of bring the storytelling aspect together with the reporting piece, and they did an audio piece that accompanied our reported piece. But I think, to your point about storytelling, I could have been a lawyer, I could have been a farmer, but I believe so passionately in the power of storytelling, actually, that is why I do what I do, because I have seen how it can really transform people's opinions and change people's minds about things. There could be a million bad news stories in a day, but I am always so proud when we run a story about something good that's actually happening, and having the ability to tell all these bright, positive stories about the food system across the country. There are millions of people and projects, and they're really together collectively, bright stars in our food system.
And to add to that, the business model, as you talked about earlier, with the closure of all the papers and the sell-off by wealthy people that don't see it as a promising investment, the business model of what you do is just so challenged.
Well, there isn't one.
Well, there isn't one, but Naomi and her team were generous enough to give all the registered students in this class a 6-month, basically free subscription to Civil Eats. And you get like 5 articles a month. And then, so if you care about this work and you care about independently produced journalism, it's just really important, again, to participate. What can I do? I can participate by supporting this kind of activity. If you're not selling ads, if you don't have classifieds, you're really dependent on the relationships that you that you feed and nurture. You have a question? Yeah. Thanks, Helen.
Hi, my name is Eleni. I'm a third-year media studies major here, and I'm working on a minor in food systems, so this lecture is right up my alley. And the question I'm about to ask, I think several things have been said already that might speak to it, but I want to know your 3 opinions directly. What would you suggest is the best way to utilize media technology on a personal level to bring more transparency to the dysfunction and injustices and, as you've pointed out, misrepresentations about what's happening in our food system right now? Curious.
I think developing the skillful means to be able to have civil conversations with people that don't share your point of view or experience becomes really critical. In this class, in past years, the final project that we've assigned was pick an issue from the class that animates you, that you feel, strongly about, and go find somebody, in your family or in your circle that doesn't share those beliefs, and try to have a conversation. I think it starts there, so I think it starts on a personal level, and I think if you can unpack the grounds, if you will, in which those kinds of conversations can take place, and then somehow transport them, like through a vehicle like Civil Eats, into where it becomes more broadly distributed, that's where I think there's a lot of power to tell a true story from true experience, and perhaps capture, like, where's the transformation, where's the opening, where's the sharing, where's the healing.
I'm curious, are you asking more as a news producer or as a news consumer?
More as a consumer. I mean, on our small level basis, I think technology, as you've suggested, taking breaks, but at the same time, it's how we consume so much of our information. It's how we talk to one another. It's how we learn, like the news, we're using Snapchat. So on a personal level, what can we do? Because media is so integrated into every single aspect of our lives, and it's powerful. But how can we cut through the...
Right. So the answer was, as a consumer, how do you cut through the barrage of information? I think you have to just put the time in, put the time in to develop trusted sources, which is good as a producer as well. Know who you're reading or who you're getting your news from. And when it comes to social media, I think it really comes down to spending the time to create a list of people that you trust or are interesting or provocative in some way and help you think those big questions through. I think a lot of what we've talked about really comes down to people need to spend more time than they're used to encountering the news, thinking about the news, and processing it and talking with others about it. That I think it's so easy to just take it all in and then move on to the next thing, that we're asking people to spend more time thinking about it, thinking about the issues, thinking about where they're getting their news from. It's more work, and I think that's a tough sell, but I think that's kind of the secret to it.
Yeah, I mean, critical thought is not highly sought after in the news cycle, right? So how do you actually slow down enough to have slow media, like slow food? How do you actually slow down enough to say, what's this content that I'm going to curate for myself? And then how am I actually consuming it? And then choosing whether to share it. I personally never tweet at people on Twitter. I don't want to engage because I actually want to talk to people. And I'm curious what people have to say. And if they want to talk to me, they can call me or email me. I'd really prefer to talk to people. We've lost that ability to have a human connection. And we think that by tweeting or being on social media or sharing a story that we're communicating. But actually, nothing could be further from the truth. So for your own personal consumption and your own interaction, like Will and Matt are saying, I will just say that curation, and then also the consumption piece slows down through the curation. We've created some Twitter lists, and I just look at those lists, and I don't spend a whole lot of time, and I want to see and there are lots of different people on those lists. And then the other piece in terms of what I share, I really think very carefully about what I share, very carefully. And I know it's a real endemic and, almost epidemic in this culture of sharing so much of what we think. But actually, not everybody needs to hear and see everything you think, as it turns out. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I think what we all feel so relieved if we didn't feel the pressure to share everything that we're thinking and feeling. And actually, we sat down with a good friend and said, hey, this is how I'm thinking and feeling. I think people crave connection so deeply and have misguided or somehow misinformed it to mean that when we're online in communication, we're communicating, and it's not the truth. So seeing your friends, back to that relationship slide Will had, connecting. We talk 1 million times a day, right? We actually talk to each other about what we're doing and try to come to some
healthy, sane balance. Yeah.
Well, on that note, that's a lovely way to end the evening tonight. You can come up after we're done and talk to Naomi and Matt, but let's have a big hand for Civil Eats. And next week, we actually are going to have Carla Vernone, who is the president of General Mills Natural and Organic Unit here, with a title of her talk called How Big Food Can Drive Big Impact. And prepare your questions for next week. It'll be a great opportunity. I want to have Allison come up and take attendance. And we will look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
I'm pretty sure that the guy sitting over to your far left is the dude from the Breakthrough Institute. All the way to the left. Okay? Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Should I take